When Rome crushed the Great Jewish Revolt in the 2nd century, it did more than burn strongholds and scatter rebels. It changed the map. Judea, a name bound to the history of the Jewish people, was reorganized under a different one, Syria Palaestina. For many, that shift has come to symbolize an empire's attempt to break a people's connection to their land. But the deeper story is stranger than that. Rome did not invent the name it used. It reached for something older, pulled from the region's deeper past, and gave it new political force at the very moment Judea lay shattered. That choice outlived the empire that made it. And once it did, the argument was never only about what a place was called, but about who had the power to decide.
Long before Rome turned the name into a policy, the word belonged to a narrower world along the southern coast of the Levant. There, in the strip of lowland facing the Mediterranean, cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath formed the core of what ancient writers remembered as Philistine territory. These were not inland hill communities like those that produced the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, but maritime-facing cities tied to trade, craft production, and the wider currents of the eastern Mediterranean. In older memories preserved by neighbors and rivals, the Philistines became more than a people. They became a marker for a landscape. That mattered because names often survive the political worlds that first gave them meaning. The Philistines did not leave behind an empire that endured for centuries, and they did not define the whole southern Levant in their own time. Their strongest footprint was coastal, regional, and contested. Yet in a land of overlapping kingdoms, shifting borders, and repeated conquest, outside observers did not always preserve local precision. A name attached to a cluster of cities could begin to drift, especially when carried by merchants, soldiers, and foreign scribes who knew the shoreline better than the interior. By the first millennium BCE, the southern Levant was already a place where memory accumulated unevenly. Different peoples named the same ground in different ways, according to what they feared, ruled, traded with, or fought over. That is part of what gave older names such strange durability. They did not need to remain accurate in a strict political sense. They only needed to remain useful to those describing the region from a distance. So, the name that would one day matter far beyond its origin did not begin as the name of an entire country or province. It began at the coast, name attached to a people long gone as a political force, waiting for larger powers to carry it farther inland.
As the eastern Mediterranean became more connected, older local names began to travel farther than the communities that first used them. Greek writers were among the first to give this process lasting written form. Looking south from the larger world of the Aegean and the imperial courts of the Near East, they did not describe the Levant with the precision of its inhabitants. They simplified, compressed, and widened. In that habit of description, the old coastal memory of the Philistines began to expand into geography. By the 5th century BCE, Herodotus was already using a form of the name, Palestine, when referring to the region between Phoenicia and Egypt. That usage matters, not because it settled a border or defined a nation, but because it shows the word circulating centuries before Rome would make it administrative. For Greek observers, the term was broad, external, and somewhat elastic. It could stretch beyond the old Philistine cities and attach itself to a larger zone of the southern Levant, the way distant map-making often turns particular histories into general labels. That broadening reveals something important about ancient geography. Names did not always move because the people attached to them expanded. Sometimes they moved because outsiders needed convenient terms for complicated landscapes. Travelers, historians, and officials did not need local precision for a name to stick. Once repeated in writing, it gained authority. None of this meant that Judea disappeared from local or political reality. Kingdoms, temples, and later provincial systems still used more specific names tied to power on the ground. But Greek usage created a second layer of memory, a wider Mediterranean habit of referring to this region with a name derived from a much older coastal past. By the time Rome entered that world, the word already existed, waiting not to be invented, but to be given a harder kind of permanence.
When Rome absorbed the eastern Mediterranean, it inherited more than territory. It inherited old names, older grievances, and a land whose religious life was tied to a single city with unusual intensity. Under Roman rule, Judea was not just another provincial district at the empire's edge. It was a place where taxation, dynastic politics, priestly authority, and imperial presence pressed against one another in ways that could not easily be separated. Roman governors might see a troublesome frontier. Many in Judea saw foreign power sitting too close to the center of the world. That strain did not begin with open war, but it was always near the surface. Local elites negotiated with Rome, kings ruled in Roman shadow, and the temple in Jerusalem remained the focal point of both worship and collective identity. The arrangement could function for a time, but it depended on restraint from both sides and on a political balance that kept narrowing. Every act of interference, financial, military, or religious, carried more weight here than it might have elsewhere. In Judea, administration was never only administration. The break came in the 1st century CE, when revolt against Rome escalated into a war of annihilation. Jerusalem fell in 70 CE. The Second Temple was destroyed. Whatever compromise had once been possible was buried with it. Yet the destruction of the temple did not pacify the province so much as alter the terms of resistance. The old center was gone, but memory became harder, not softer. Roman victory had imposed order without settling the deeper question of who the land belonged to under empire. In the decades that followed, Judea remained marked by loss, surveillance, and unfinished defiance. Rome had crushed rebellion, but not the conviction that foreign rule was intolerable. The province still carried its old name, though now under the shadow of catastrophe, and that made the next uprising more dangerous than the first.
The final break came under Hadrian. In 132 CE, revolt flared again in Judea, this time with enough force and organization to become something more than scattered resistance. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, the uprising established a rebel administration, struck coinage over Roman issues, and briefly reclaimed parts of the land for a restored Jewish order. That alone reveals how much remained at stake. This was not only anger at Roman rule, but an attempt to reverse it with institutions, symbols, and territory of its own. Rome answered with overwhelming force. The war that followed was long, brutal, and costly, even by imperial standards. Roman legions and auxiliary forces moved through fortified sites and villages in a campaign of reduction rather than one decisive battle. Ancient sources describe devastation on a vast scale, though their numbers are debated. What is clear is the outcome. The revolt was crushed, much of Judea was left shattered, and the demographic and political center of Jewish life in the region was profoundly altered. It is in that aftermath that the naming question becomes more than a detail. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, with its older identity subordinated to imperial design. Around the same period, the province of Judea was reorganized under the name Syria Palaestina. No surviving Roman decree plainly explains the motive for that change, and certainty is impossible. But placed beside the refounding of Jerusalem and the scale of the repression, the rename is hard to separate from a broader program of restructuring after revolt.
Rome did not need to announce a symbolic message for the message to exist. A new urban name, a new provincial frame, and a devastated land could together do the work of conquest more completely than destruction alone. Judea had rebelled as Judea. Rome would rule it under another name, and that distinction would not end with Hadrian.
To a modern eye, a provincial rename can look cosmetic, as though Rome had merely changed a label on a map. In practice, names inside the empire were part of the machinery that made territory governable. The principle is familiar even now. Once a state standardizes a name, the name begins to do political work. A province was not just a place, but a unit of taxation, military command, legal jurisdiction, census taking, and record. Once a name entered that system, it moved through orders, reports, and supply routes until it became the state's working reality for the region. That is what made Syria Palaestina more than a gesture. The new title placed the former province of Judea inside a broader Roman frame, less tied to the historic identity that had fueled repeated rebellion. Whether the aim was punishment, stabilization, or administrative reorganization, the effect was similar. A land long associated in Roman rule with the Jews was now absorbed into terminology that diluted that specificity. Empires often preferred broader names because they were easier to manage than stubborn local ones. There was a quiet logic to that rule. A provincial title did not need to persuade the inhabitants. It only had to standardize how officials, soldiers, and distant administrators referred to the territory. Over time, that official language shaped the habits of people who had never seen the land itself. What began as administration became geography, and geography could outlive changes in dynasty, religion, and language. That is why the rename mattered beyond Hadrian's reign. Once the Roman state fixed the region into its paperwork, later powers inherited more than roads and ruined cities. They inherited a name already embedded in the way the wider world had learned to see the land.
Empires fell, religions shifted, and the language of the region changed, but the name Rome had fixed in administration did not vanish with Roman rule. In late antiquity, the Eastern Empire and the Christian world that grew within it continued to use forms of Palestine in both governance and sacred geography. Pilgrims traveling to Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and the Jordan preserved the land not only through devotion but through description. They carried older terms into itineraries, sermons, and maps, placing the region in the imagination of distant believers. A bureaucratic label was becoming something larger, a familiar name in the religious memory of the Mediterranean. That continuity mattered because later powers rarely started from nothing. Byzantine administration preserved regional terminology in altered form, and the early Islamic caliphates inherited a landscape already layered with Roman and late antique habits of naming. Arabic forms, such as Jund Philistin, show that the word had not merely survived on parchment. It had entered another governing system, another language, and another imperial order. The name endured not because history stood still, but because each new regime found older geography useful. Yet continuity of name did not mean continuity of people, politics, or identity. The populations of the region changed across centuries through war, conversion, migration, and ordinary demographic life. What Palestine meant in a Byzantine Christian context was not what it meant under Rome, and neither was the same as its meaning in later Islamic or Ottoman usage. The word endured, but the world inside it kept changing. That is what gives the naming history its lasting tension. A term that began in the memory of a coastal people and hardened under Roman rule after revolt outlived every state that first defined it. By the time the modern age inherited the name, it already carried the weight of many vanished worlds.
Yet, the endurance of the name did not mean the disappearance of older bonds to the land. Long after Rome crushed revolt and renamed the province, Jewish life in the region continued, even as war, exile, and dispersion transformed its scale and center of gravity. Communities remained, especially in Galilee, where rabbinic life took on renewed importance after the destruction of the temple. The land endured in Jewish memory, not as a distant relic, but as a living axis of prayer, law, and historical identity. The loss of sovereignty did not end the connection. It changed the form it took. Across centuries of diaspora, that attachment was carried in liturgy, pilgrimage, scholarship, and the recurring hope of return, even when political power lay elsewhere. In that sense, Jewish continuity followed a different path from the continuity of the name Palestine. One survived through administration, maps, and vocabularies of empire. The other survived through communal life, worship, memory, and the refusal to let the land become spiritually remote. So the history of the region cannot be told only through the endurance of one name. It must also be told through the endurance of a people's bond to the same land, even when empire stripped them of control over it.
Rome did not invent the name Palestine. What it did was more consequential. It took an older word, one already circulating beyond the region, and fixed it to the land in the aftermath of catastrophe. After the Bar Kokhba Revolt, that choice became part of imperial rule, then part of religious geography, then part of the language later empires inherited. But they did not inherit the world that had first produced it. The result was not a straight line from antiquity to the present, but something more durable and more difficult. A name carrying different meanings through different ages, while never quite shedding the memory of conquest that helped entrench it. That is why this history resists simple slogans. The question is not which name is more ancient in some absolute sense, but how names are used to define belonging after war, rebellion, and rule. Long after Rome disappeared, its map still lingered. And that may be the deeper lesson here. Once power names a place, the argument can last for centuries. If anything in this story remains unsettled, it is because names rarely stop being political when empires end. What began as an imperial decision did not remain confined to Rome. Tell us in the comments where you think that transformation becomes most visible in the story. Subscribe for more histories of how authority, memory, and inheritance continue cross centuries. And for another story about ideas moving far beyond the world that first formed them, continue with We Found the Original Apocalypse, Not Biblical. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, the past is never only preserved in ruins, but in the terms later worlds learn to live inside.